Events like this are made possible by people like you. Donate today at inclusion.ca/donate.
My name is Matricia Bauer, and I'm a local knowledge keeper from Jasper, Alberta, Canada. And it's my pleasure to be here today and open up the 6 Degrees Global Online Community. What an honor to acknowledge the land of Canada and Turtle Island on behalf of the 11 treaties signed by the First Nations people of Canada, the proud Métis, and the Inuit of the North. In our language, Kataskinauna and Kataskiuma means our land, and this is your land. And I'd like to sing a song. It's called Osini, and Osini means the rock, and the biggest rock that we have is the Mother Earth. And this is a song that was written by my daughter Mackenzie, and I'd like to share that with you right now. With my hands on the rock and the water rushing past, you know I've never felt so alive. And when you take away my names and the stories of my life, I'll return to the place where I become alive. Osini, 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 Osini. And when I'm in amongst the trees and the mountains all around, that is when I see that I'm so very small. We're a little tiny part of this big beautiful world, and when you strip all of us down, we're standing on equal ground.
Hi, I'm Naveen Peters, Vice President of Advancement at the University of Calgary. The U of C is delighted to support 6 Degrees as a presenting partner. 6 Degrees is leading important conversations about issues that impact our global society, and conversations like these require different perspectives, new approaches, and brave voices. The university recognizes the incredible value of these conversations, particularly during this unprecedented time. Our scholars specialize in and emphasize pluralism, inclusion, and diversity. The issues that we're discussing and unpacking at 6 Degrees are more relevant and urgent now than ever before. And the University of Calgary is proud to be a presenting partner with 6 Degrees and a leader in this valuable conversation as we work together for a brighter future.
So why a LaFontaine-Baldwin lecture series? Well, in 1840, they founded a new style pro-democracy movement based on inclusion, egalitarianism, nonviolent methods, and nonviolent resistance. And they were about the age of most of the people on this meeting. In fact, they were younger than a number of us by a long shot. In 1842, they were elected VPs of the International Anti-Slavery Society, And LaFontaine went on to write a book against slavery and describing the history of slavery in Canada. In 1848, in March, right at the beginning of the European Democratic Spring, they won an election and came to power. And unlike the European equivalents, they managed to hold on to that power, even though they were faced by massive, violent, anti-democratic demonstrations, burning down of parliament, assassination attempts. Over the next 3 years in power, they put into place the positive basis of Canadian laws and policies. Of course, that didn't erase the negative. They're still with us, but they showed that there was a possible path forward towards an inclusive, nonviolent, egalitarian society. So this lecture series was created to give voice to what needs to be done, not just in Canada, but in any of our countries, to continue that kind of process today and tomorrow.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. Most descriptions of the time we are living in have started to sound like cliches. We say we are passing through an unprecedented, extraordinary, astonishing period of human history. Those words actually fall short. This time of pandemic has shown us the consequences of the climate emergency, the wealth gap, racial division, and the failure of politics in sharp relief. We all know the crisis is real. At 6 Degrees, we try to rise above cliches. We try to engage in conversations that challenge us, but also direct our energies to make a difference. Above all, we have hope that we can find some ways of making our society more just, more inclusive, and more democratic. A few weeks ago, the 18th LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture brought together 9 past lecturers to address some fundamentally difficult questions. What has the pandemic revealed about the divide between winners and losers, insiders and outsiders? And what will it take to emerge from these crises as more just and inclusive societies? The lecturers gave us a lot to think about. They had the courage to disagree, and they left us with a burst of ideas. Today, we return to these questions and we take up the discussion again. We are ready to push the conversation forward, and we've gathered 15 remarkable changemakers from around the world: activists, organizers, writers, artists, thinkers, and scholars, and we've thrown them a challenge. What are they doing to tackle the crisis? What ideas and initiatives are driving their creativity and their energy? Where do we find the dynamic and bold ideas and solutions we're looking for? I'm your host, journalist and educator, Abdulrahman Malik, and over the next hour, we are going to try to answer these questions. And where I'd love to begin the conversation is for us to really think about what our 9 lecturers at the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture a few weeks ago. What were the ideas that they engaged in that stuck with you, that made sense to you, or that perhaps challenged you? Renata, I wonder if we can come to you first on this.
Yeah, I will challenge everybody probably with a fact. We are somehow not the 1%, but we are in the 10% of privileged population, and we have to come to terms with that, and we have to be aware of that. We witness and we are witnessing as this crisis unfolds terrible inequalities, and somehow this situation made us aware of how privileged we are, and with privilege we need to become aware of our responsibility on this.
Yeah, so you've played a role in government, and you've played a role in civil society, and hearing what Renata is saying, it's certainly resonating with me. Our positionality matters so much. How do you view this year's LaFontaine-Baldwin Lectures conversation?
Yeah, I think what was striking for me from that conversation was the restating of the foregone conclusion that we all I believe, agree on now, that this pandemic has really laid bare the fault lines in our society. It has really exposed the inequalities, the systemic issues. We've known them for some time, but what we're seeing this pandemic is that it's just took the biggest flashlight it could find and just shone on it. And so that got reaffirmed in that conversation among the 9 lecturers who participated. The question, I think, for all of us is, now that we know this, and we've known this for a while, but now that the wound is so out in the open as a result of this pandemic, and we are trying to build this new normal, is the new normal going to look like the old normal? Or is going to be something new? And I think that's the challenge upon all of us.
And I don't know how we will look on it in the next 6, 12, 18 months when we build this somehow new normal, how it looks like, which side will win, how we can use this pandemic. And I see that there are a lot of difference growing up on the both sides, because everyone is looking a little bit different on the causes, on the consequences of the pandemic. And I don't know whether the pandemic in the end leads to more tension within societies than cooperation, where it should be, from my point of view.
I think the question that comes to me is that each of you are active and activating work and initiatives and ideas in your own geographies and your own spheres. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the single most important thing that you've learned from this moment of crisis, this pandemic, whether those are learnings about society or yourselves? And Mariko, I'd love to start with you with that question, because I know that the work that you do is supporting cutting edge research, is going into the field of the humanities and facilitating those who are asking some of these questions and trying to answer them. So in a way, you have a bit of an eagle-eye view of sort of the landscape of ideas, and we want to pick your brains on that.
I think it raised real questions for us, or for me, about the structure and infrastructure of society. Those things were visible before, but the depth and pervasiveness and the intensity of the depth and pervasiveness, I think, is something that has been revealed in a public-facing way, as opposed to, let's say, a scholar-facing way or an institutional-facing way, that we in the United States certainly have not yet really thought through what that means about everything from public policy to community, and how we think about what we mean when we say community, what we mean when we say included, and what we mean when we say equity. Because those things, we toss them around, frankly, but getting deeper into what they mean and what that means about the kinds of institutional change that's really required of us.
Nicola, I want to pick that up because I know in your work, you work with institutions and you work in your city around not just social inclusion, but around projects of social change. Does what Mariko says resonate with you? And I guess from your positionality, what are you taking away from this pandemic moment right now in terms of your work and your innovation and creativity?
One thing this pandemic has reminded me of is the crucial importance of big systemic decisions and institutions. It was obvious, for instance, how much of a difference a public healthcare system made in the health outcomes of citizens, and in general for a society to be resilient. The hardest hit countries, not necessarily in terms of number of cases, but in their capacity to resist and bounce back, were countries where neoliberal policies had the biggest footholds in the last few decades. So one thing this pandemic has done for me is rekindle my desire to get involved at a political level that is above the strictly local or the small scale, which are still important, but with the climate crisis looming also more than ever, I feel like we need social democratic governments that will make our societies stronger by taking care of their individual citizens, redistributing wealth, taming social divisions, etc. And that kind of thing can best be done at a a superior level of government. And I feel like I have to get back in that game also.
I wanted to back up a bit and pick up a point that was raised by a few different folks about a revealing of the fault lines, and to share how infuriating that actually is for people like myself, people that I know who have been advocating for this change and actually revealing the deepness, the deep rootedness of how broken systems are and how harmful they are, in particular to Indigenous, Black, and folks of color. And so when all of a sudden I'm hearing leaders speak to this awakening, I'm wondering, why were you sleeping so long? Because there really is no excuse in the world that we live in to turn a blind eye to these things for so long. And so for me, some of the thing that I think is something that's really important that this crisis has revealed is not that these fault lines exist, but how unequipped some folks in power and leadership are to deal with the chaos and the crisis. And so what we actually get is reacting and not responding. And the reacting just reinforces what is status quo under the guise of change, under the guise of progress, or even under the guise of just transition, which is a great buzzword for people to bring into their lexicon, I think. This moment is really performative for some people. And I see a lot of leaders using the words, but leaving the work out. And so there's a really disappointing amount of hypocrisy in the response narrative. And it really reveals to me that many people in power are actually resisting change. And there's an ability to position change while also actually creating more of the same. And it's a devious sort of situation, I think, that we're in, and that we need to be very much attuned to. And for me, the world cannot be reimagined without us being relentless about centering people who are most impacted by the brutality of the systems. And these are systems that have been built from the beginning to create dispossession of folks like Indigenous peoples, Black folks. And it's an important time for us to really like honor that truth and honor that history. And so for me, that's why the abolition movements are really fascinating and also critical for us to be understanding those. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation and question that we're just waking up now.
And Jess, thank you so much for bringing that to the table, because I think so much of it as well, to me, feels like suddenly it's appropriate, right, for the normative people to start saying, okay, like, wake up, and everyone else has been dealing with this for centuries, right? The people power is what's really so pivotal, especially during these pandemic times. And for me, I'm thinking about how business really cannot go on as usual. And I even find myself in situations where I think people are fine, being in their homes and being in the virtual reality, when people are, literally losing their lives, losing their homes, losing their jobs. This is something that requires all of us to reimagine what it looks like to live in a society and be in community with one another, especially on the generational level. That's something that I see really important. We see people in the streets, young people, right, fighting for Black lives. And it's just, we need everybody at the table. We need to listen to those leaders.
Yana, how did these conversations appear to you from your European vantage point? Because I think not, this is not only the fault line. I think what has been identified is historic reality, but also this reality coming to consciousness at this moment among a broader group of people, those people who haven't been affected by that kind of that kind of extreme inequality. How does it feel from where you are?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that what we are seeing in the pandemic shows us the national problems we have anyways with socioeconomic inequalities, racism, and classism, for example. And I think it's really interesting what the pandemic shows me is that how much is possible if there's the political will in a government to do something. Like, for example, now in the German government, they see this as a crisis, which it obviously is. And they mobilize these huge funds, right, to support the economy, to support people who have lost their jobs, to strengthen the social welfare system, the healthcare system, but we don't see the same urgency when it comes, for example, to eradicate racism or when it comes to the climate crisis. So I think this is something we can take from this pandemic, that all great social change has come from movements pushing for it, and a lot more is possible than governments make us think there is. You know what I mean? So I think this is something I take from this whole situation with me, that you just have to put more pressure on a government to see things as a crisis.
Picking up from where kind of Antonia left off, what's exciting you about something concrete that has happened during these last 6 months, which makes you say, that's something that we need to pay attention to?
Abdul, I will give you examples, but perhaps not really optimistic examples, but I think they are very constructive anyway. But before doing that, I think it's also nice to start from the coincidence that many of us are here in Berlin. And 30 years ago, we saw the end of a dispute between two big political regimes. And now, fast forward 30 years later, what we see is the hegemony of one real social regime, which is global, and which is also facing now a big crisis through this pandemic. I don't really think the pandemic exposed the problems of this regime. I think the pandemic just maximized the logics of this regime, which is, by the way, is the logics of inequalities that were already mentioned here. The people who were rich, they are just becoming richer. The privileged ones are just being more privileged than before.
Zakir, I saw you nodding your head and responding as the various comments were coming in. How are you reading these fault lines?
Right. I think there's a word that can help explain a lot of this, which is a lack of resiliency. We have been so obsessed, and when I say we, I mean the power structures have been so obsessed with growth and with building with more and more and more, as opposed to being able to respond in times of crisis. What is the point of government if it is not to help people in times of crisis? So, for example, at least in the U.S. context, we've seen our educational systems have fallen apart, our political systems have fallen apart. So many things are breaking up and being pulled apart. And yet one thing that has somehow managed to endure the pandemic and even do better is the stock market. Because the stock market literally had circuit breakers in place that prevented market crashes, and then the Fed has been pumping with money. Why is that? It's because powers that be have pushed the government to do that for the stock market. And that has not happened for racism. That's not happening for healthcare. That's not happening for education. And so we've been so preoccupied with growth and with making particular elements of our system resilient. When the people really need it, there's no resilience and there's no sustainability and inclusion on those fronts. And so I think for moving ahead, we have to really think about how do we take a step back from more and focus on how do we ensure we have systems that are strong enough to withhold and withstand during crisis.
To Zakir's last point around resiliency, I would say that's something that really does resonate with me. I think increasingly I see organizations and institutions moving away from that conversation around recovery to now resilience, because by nature, it's just part of how we're formed as humans. But another thing that really does resonate, and I see it as a common thread with some of the conversations that have come up, is around community and the power of solidarity. But on another hand, the insularism that is emerging. It feels like increasingly as a society or as a world, we're coming to this crossroads where, yes, we're all facing the same issues with regards to the health pandemic, but we're all experiencing it differently. And so comes the question of, if not now, when are we going to make those choices and those decisions to help us really move the needle?
If not now, when? Michael?
I have difficulties with the whole concept of resiliency and using that to frame discussions. I have difficulties because the tendency is then to look at those who are experiencing, in this case, the oppression. The oppression that's coming out right now is only being highlighted because of COVID, but it's always been there. And the tendency is to look at those who are facing oppression to be resilient but not necessary to look at the oppression or the issues that are causing the need for resiliency. And unless we're willing to look beyond what's within an individual or within a society, within a community, for them to be resilient, we won't look at the issues that are maintaining the concerns. I think a key part that moves away from that is the whole concept of relationships between peoples, between communities, between groups, and that the importance of relationships provides the opportunity for people to see that our individual actions, our community actions, our nation's actions is impacting others. So I think a key piece I would look at more so is relationships over resiliency.
I mean, that's a fascinating framing, Michael, and I think it in some ways brings us back to the beginning of the thread of this particular conversation, Jess, which was your intervention around what do we see and what do we don't see. And I'd love to hear your response to this really kind of powerful juxtaposition of relationship and resiliency.
Yeah, I love that because to me, I think that the idea of resiliency is something that is from the context of an Indigenous person, it's sort of like forced on us based on what has happened to us, but it erases all of the resilient practices that we have in community, which includes things like our relationships and our kinships. And so I think that the resiliency of community rather than the resiliency of systems is where the focus and the attention needs to go to. As Adrienne Maree Brown says, you know, what we pay attention to grows, and that there's so much growth in that community work right now that is really beautiful and powerful because of relationship. And so I see all of this new information, new practices and new structures that are actually presenting themselves through the work of grassroots. And in particular through the movement for Black lives. And for me, we need to pay attention to that gift of knowledge. We need to respond together to the movement moments that present themselves by seeing and honoring how movement has been responding to the needs of community.
We have seen very vividly in this moment that what preceded this moment in so many ways was a gross failure of imagination. Yana, you mentioned the need to rethink the way that we pressure governments. But it's also rethinking, and I absolutely agree with that. And crisis is one way to do that. The other way to do that is or an additional way to do that is to appeal to our imaginative capacity. People have said this moment requires the full force of our imagination. And I believe that that's true. In fact, the full force of our moral imagination. But we need to dig into what that means. And not just putting it on the website, but what does that mean in the doing, right? What does that mean in the work? What does that mean about who we're centering, who we're listening to, and how we reflect on our own complicity and our own comfort, frankly, with the systems as they are, with our own privilege in the systems as they are. And how do we then think about how to disrupt them? And what kind of moral courage and moral imagination does that take to do?
And in particular, where Mariko left us there about this kind of crisis of imagination, how do you view that crisis, John, and how do we pivot from there?
I've actually been thrilled with the way this conversation is going. And I do think the big warning for all of us, and it's in that, I think Jess and Michael talked about it, this resiliency of communities, and I would put imagination with that and memory and grassroots versus how power has constructed itself. And over the last half century, I'm not saying it was wonderful before, but over the last half century, really Western governments in particular have become increasingly structured, not simply around ideology and money and markets, but more fundamentally around a utilitarian way of doing things. And that's been a big protection for power. And that, of course, has driven imagination out. You are not rewarded in large organizations or in power for imagination. And it's getting imagination as one of the key tools of how do you make society function. Getting imagination back into the core of it is absolutely key. And I just give you a tiny example. Every morning, I write about this, so I notice, every morning I notice more and more what you might call controllers of how power functions today slipping forward the idea, we can't go into debt anymore. We don't really have the money. It's okay while this is going on. So they're recreating the fear that debt will destroy us. And what they're trying to do is prevent this crisis from turning into real change. They're trying to prevent imagination and prevent imagination from getting into power. So it's a very dangerous moment that while we're all doing grassroots and things, that in fact, they're in the structures of power, many of them, and they're pushing it towards, we got to shut this down before it's too late and it destroys us economically. That's the dangerous argument.
Michael, I'm gonna come to you because I know you wanted to kind of weigh in on this discussion around imagination and the exclusion of the imagination.
One of the things that's happening right now is that people are based in fear. That the virus that as it currently is has raised people's levels of fear to touch those people who are in positions of making to exercise power to make decisions that's impacting many people. I would suggest that imagination and matters of fear don't fit well with one another. And the reason I say that is that in the societies that we see, those in positions of power are trying to maintain the structures as they are so that they can maintain particular positions, abilities to exercise their power, abilities to earn money. So to change this society, this changes the structures, change our experiences, requires imagination. Hence, people aren't so keen on incorporating imagination and new ideas. Hence, they intend to exclude people who are bringing in new ideas. And that's people, whether they're refugees or whether they're long-term imaginations of Indigenous peoples throughout the world and what they bring forth with different perspectives than the mainstream that's in many of our societies in controlling power.
That is a perfect place to go to you and Antonia. You kind of work within politics, within the kind of a major foundation that does grassroots programming. Where do you feel has been something exciting, something that has excited you during this period, a project, an initiative, something that you feel is kind of responding with imagination to this particular moment?
I think we see it everywhere. Like, for example, in Germany, we have a big movement for refugees, for evacuating refugees from Moria, an island on the Mediterranean. And you see a lot of people who, as some people already have said, there's a window of opportunity for change. So people see there is enough money if you have the a topic on your priority list. So yeah, I see a lot of young people especially who start to engage in politics and to go on in public places to show their opinion about issues and to take a stand in this whole process of thinking about another way of living together in a society.
Antonia, I wonder, and sort of to push ahead with that for just a moment, are these young people participating in existing political parties and institutions, or do you see the creation of new movements, or are they revitalizing old movements?
I think it's all of it. There are people joining already existing groups. They are getting bigger, and there are also new groups, like people who never have started anything politically before. Yeah, and they build initiatives, and they work together in their neighborhoods and start projects together.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because Antonia mentioned the solidarity movement for refugees, and yes, it's there. It's a lot of young people, but it has been there for quite a while, for a few years now. But I think, and this is interesting, in a pandemic, you see how the government, for example, in Germany, or even in the European Union, first of all, I would say that the nation state is definitely not dead, because you can see in the European Union how most countries behave very nationalistic, and they look at their country first when it came to dealing with the crisis. And then the government also shows its limits when it comes to solidarity. Like, they're always stressing that we have to take care of each other, protective measures are very important, but on the other hand, when it comes to refugee camps in Germany, or when it comes to refugee camps in Greece, for example, they don't care about protective measures. They don't care about decent living, for example. People can't even wash their hands there. So it's very nationalistic, and it's really excluding when, on the one hand, they try to stress how important it is that we are all very careful and then we don't get the virus and we look at all the protective measures, but it doesn't belong to everyone. It's only a certain kind of group, and definitely not people who are refugees. So I think this is very problematic.
I really fear for solidarity. It's a word we've mentioned a few times today, and we certainly need it at this time, and with what's coming also. And we've seen new kinds of solidarity grow in the last few years, I would say, and months even. But at the same time, there's been this division, growing division. And we certainly see it in Quebec, and I know that in different parts of the world, that division is growing also. And at this point in time, I'm really struggling with the idea of how do you build that solidarity that is needed with the challenges we are facing today and will be facing even more in the years to come, at a point in time when the tearing apart of society is stronger than it's been in my lifetime.
Renata, I know you're like all of us in this room, you work on developing spaces for solidarity. The work that you're doing right now is around that. Nicola has asked a really important and vital question. How are we building solidarities in the face of all these systemic, social, political crises and barriers?
You know, like there's this fascination with grassroots, but I have to be like very bold in this. We need to seize power. We need to not to be shy as civil society to get into politics. We need to be empowered. We need to encourage young people to be political and to form political parties. Political parties were demonized, and it's like kind of like this silly division. Politics is dirty, politics is dangerous, politics is corruption. It is the only way to access to fast changes. And I get pissed when I get angry when people like become shy of power. I think that, the baby boomers generation showed us that they're incapable of managing this situation right now, with apologies to baby boomers, but is the evidence right there? And never before was a generation replacement was more urgent than today. So what I'm doing with my work with the Progressive International is precisely that: encourage young people to get into politics, to be political, to engage with and start forming progressive political parties. Because if we do not want the politics to be, if we do not want to be run by incompetent people, we need to be the ones running the show. And for that, it is a long process, and we can access, we can be city councils and then go all the way up. Or we can just go get the shortcut and go for all and everything. But if this pandemic showed me something, is that the wrong people are in power, and it's not only because of all the things that we have been discussing today, but it's because of our reluctance of ethical, principled people to get our hands, not dirty, but get our hands busy and try to become the next mayor, the next minister, the next deputy mayor, the next president. So I'm up for it. That's I think that my plan for the next 10 years to fix this mess is to get as many progressives in as possible into power. And I hope that many of you here will be willing to join my struggle.
I think that is kind of a vital sort of, let's put that on a poster. Do not be afraid of power.
Yeah, I agree with what Renata said. Doing something in society, seeking power, starting a business with ethical, fundamental, doing something, changing people, connecting people. So it's doing something, be active, be a player on the field and not a bystander and just cheering and applauding the other people, but taking on and be proactive and do something where your heart is beating for.
At the risk of being a bit too fascinated with the grassroots, I'm just going to echo the same thing that Renata said already. And I think that on my end, I would say there is some taking of that power that's happening already. We just need to agitate a bit more. We need to move the needle a bit more, I would say, to answer Nicolas' point around whether or not there is more division now than solidarity. I would say from where I'm sitting or standing, there is a brewing emergence of solidarity. For instance, I think of myself as a person of color, as a Black person, and how just with the Black Lives Matter movement, how en masse people across board, Indigenous people, other allies came to the streets to protest that. I think there is quite a bit more of organizing that we need to do. I think there is that trust that we're seeing. There is an erosion of trust that we're seeing in traditional systems, and we need to start to rethink. It might not be as organized as we probably want it to be, but I think that people are starting to take that bulls by the horn, and at best we can all just ensure that we're at the table and ready to go when the opportunities present themselves.
I was thinking on this interesting way the conversation has been getting, and the example I had in Mexico, what we have been doing, and in many countries of Latin America, we have been doing the same. The big problem one of the big problems of pandemic was education. So teachers and parents and even students start raising up their voice saying the government is not doing a good effort to give quality education in this moment. So we gather up, and together with universities and NGOs, the government moved and said, okay, how are we gonna do it? And they put education on TV. So I think it's an example on how politics can be made in the practice, no? How can we change, no? And I know that it's been doing in Bolivia and in Ecuador and in Argentina, and we are now sharing like never before strategies, no? And ways to really get a really good education in this reality that we have now. And that is the way that we can do it.
I think this is leading us forward. Marco, I know you wanted a quick intervention on the discussion so far. Let's hear from you.
I want to lift up what Renata and others have said about power and reinforce that power is not only present in political systems, power is present in all kinds of institutions and systems. So the institution that you're in, there are opportunities to think about its relationship to power, your relationship to power, the power dynamics within that organization or institution, and think about whether they are the ones you want. Not just the ones you want to hold or don't want to hold, but whether they are the dynamics that you want to see. Because the logic of the institution or the organization will drive things in a certain direction. And so is there something in there that you want to disrupt or rethink? And also when you're in the position of power, thinking about which of the logics of that position or institution you want to take on and take in, to the point that was made earlier about all of the things that we say we can't do, right? All of the things that we say are impossible. Hold on to the things that you think ought to be possible, and try to maneuver and use your power within the organization to make them possible. That's the real exercise of power.
Yasser, you've been someone who's been very close to and part of political power. How are we feeling about this question of power, the use of it, the disruption of it?
I agree with all the points being made. Running for office is important because that's where the power is, and you can make change. Power that exists in other fora where you can make change. Here's the caution. Here's the warning. With power comes a lot of pressure to defend the status quo, because that's how you maintain power. And with power also comes after a while, because you become part of the power structure, to maintain power, and therefore you become defenders of status quo. How do we resist that temptation to continue to challenge the status quo so that we can continue to affect change is something we also have to remember.
Thank you for that caution, Yasser. And I think that leads us into this kind of last round of conversation. And I'm going to go to you, Antonia. You know, I'm going to wake up tomorrow. Our audience is going to wake up tomorrow. Our hearts, our minds, our spirits are going to be buzzing with some of the big and difficult questions that we've asked today. What should we be doing tomorrow to see the kind of change that we want to see in the world at this time of crisis?
I hope that everyone wakes up with a big enthusiasm to raise their own voice and to do this like in this various ways that were already mentioned in this conversation. Like it doesn't matter if you go in an already existing group or you just initiate a group yourself. It's just important that you raise your voice and that you look for other people who share the same values and goals as you do, and then you'll find a way. And of course, parties are one way, and a way that that you can be influential, especially in political systems, like for example we have in Germany. So I would always encourage all the people in the audience to join a party or other political group tomorrow.
Well, it's not an easy answer, but definitely organize. I don't necessarily think you have to go to a political party or seize political power. But like I said, I think social change has come from people's movements, putting pressure on political parties. So I think this is very important. And also you have to kind of change the agenda.
Yes, your initial intervention, I think, really opened the way for this conversation around power and privilege. What should we be doing tomorrow?
Overthrow the government? Just kidding. Maybe I'm not. What can we be doing tomorrow? You know, this is kind of cliche, but it's sort of, what I'm noticing is how we're unable to connect what we think and what we believe to how our bodies respond in the moment. And so I think we need to practice how our bodies show up. And so tomorrow, I hope that people might ask themselves, to pick up this conversation about imagination, how am I going to carve out space for imagination today? For myself, for someone in my family, for someone in the institution or organization that I work with. Shifting how we show up personally and professionally, I think is like crucial. And practicing showing up in solidarity for someone. You know, show up.
Showing up, doing the work. However you individually, personally define all the work and what work needs to be done, but I feel like it's the only thing to do day after day. However hopeless or pessimistic we might be, do the work and do it in a bold and courageous way. Courage will be a very important value in the years and decades to come. I think it has to be a guiding principle for us to be courageous, however we define it. And that's the only thing that we can offer against hopelessness, is doing the work with courage.
Every time that you stay passive and you do nothing when somebody is eroding your rights, you lose. And it took generations to get the rights that we enjoy today. And our duty is to advance our rights, not to lose them and to erode them for the next generation. It's not only about us, it is about those coming after us. So that discipline in defending our rights and exercising our rights.
What does tomorrow hold for us?
And tomorrow holds for us keeping our eyes on the prize and recognizing where the end game is. It is not just to be out on the streets. It's not just to make a point. It's not just to be an advocate or whatever. It is to finally make it to the place where we have a seat at the table.
I wanted to pull together the focus on relationships. I think as we hopefully achieve power, keeping in mind who you're in relation with, who you're engaging with, who you're centering, who you're talking to, so that you don't get sucked under by the trappings of power, as Yasser said, so that we don't get sucked under by the assumptions that we brought with us.
Don't look away anymore. Get connected with people. And I think what's key, don't lose your imagination. Imagine where you, where we want to stand. And as Mariko said, prepare for the long run. It's more a marathon than the 100-meter sprint.
I would say be uncomfortable in all the situations. You know, there's such a need right now to listen and to learn from other people. And the last thing that I would just note is we have such a focus on voting, and I know it's really important, but to me, as someone who works in civic engagement and now is in office, I see everything that happens before you vote and everything after as just as important, if not more so. So making sure that even if you go to vote, right, you're being really attentive to what your leaders are doing and you're bringing other folks with you to the table, because that's where real change will happen.
Yeah, I'll just start from I'll take it back to where I started from, which is the question around, if not now, when? Whatever direction you feel like your life should be going, whether it's holding power, whether it's supporting power, whether it's pushing against the status quo, now is the best time to make that move. So make that move right now and find your tribe, find your allies as you move along.
It is a matter of power. We need to understand that power is not only the ability to decide for myself, but also the ability to spread these decisions that affect other people. We have a huge challenge in produce credibility for institutions. So I completely agree with my colleagues. Power has to be converted into credibility. That's the only way to shape good behavior collectively for our communities.
First, there is no one answer. There's going to be multiple ways of going forth. With that said, there's either looking at the concentration of power and how to influence that, or to look at the masses and the broad spectrum of power. Coming from the perspective of looking at the broad spectrum of power, then I would suggest listen, relate, share, and lead from behind.
Adding to the richness, everything that has been said here, I think it would be coherence in yourself on what you think, what you say, what you do. And it doesn't matter if it's in a political party, as Antonia says, as it's being sustainable, as Jaina says, but feeling that you are the one and that you are true to yourself, and find your tribe, but don't forget to listen to the others that don't think like you, because that's part of growth.
We have to build an inclusive society. In order to build a resilient society or economy, as was spoken of earlier, we have to bring those who are excluded, the marginalized, in. I think that's the task before us. If we build resiliency like we did in the last crisis in 2008, 2009, by bailing out companies that were too big to fail, for instance, then we're just basically revalidating the status quo. And my fear is that may be the direction we're going towards in this crisis, where basically we are reaffirming the structures that exist. We have to bring inclusion in the conversation. We need to bring those who are excluded inside the room and share power with them.
John, this has really been a marvelous exchange of ideas, and I think we've hit on some really important sort of centers of gravity: power, solidarity, inclusion, privilege, organizing, change, showing up, getting educated, understanding. Having heard this conversation and reflecting back on the LaFontaine-Baldwin Lecture this year, what would you leave with us for the tomorrow that we have to begin?
I think this idea of showing up is incredibly important. Being there, this was denied for almost 40 years, that you had to show up with ideas and with belief and with purpose. I do think it's really important to be constantly thinking about the difference between strategy and tactics. You have to do both. And I think everyone in this group is doing both. But you have to think to yourself, if this is tactics, it's tactics, it'll help. But what are the key strategies that can actually turn the line, that can change the way power functions, at least for a time? A really good strategy is always based on at least two things: ethics and imagination, which I was thrilled that we ended up talking a great deal about. The only kind of ethics which really holds is conscious ethics. In the beginning, it can be almost instinctual, but it's a muscle. You build it through action. And if the ethics becomes conscious, you can really do something. And I think this terrible crisis, which is not a health crisis, it's a health crisis, a social crisis, a racial crisis, an economic, it's a crisis in every direction. The one thing that it has done is made those who want to be ethical conscious about what it takes to actually act in an ethical way. And I think that is the solid base for going into power. And I think that's why one of the central messages in this whole conversation is about, we've got to take power. Renata's great. We've got to take power. How do we take power? Are we ready for power? What does power require? All of those things. I think the moment you have a conscious sense of your ethics, then the next step is power.
Thank you, John.
And can I say one last thing? I'm sorry. One last
John,
thing.
you have 20 seconds.
Right, no, it's less than that. LaFontaine and Baldwin would have loved this conversation. I've read everything they've written and said in all those debates. This is exactly what they were talking about in the 1830s and 40s.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank each and every one of you, Mariko, Nicola, Renata, Michael, Samantha, Robin, Jess, Gabriela, Yana, Zaka, Ruth, Rafael, Yasser, Antonia, and of course, John Rostasol, for what has been an amazingly rich conversation. Thank you for not only bringing your experience and your perspectives to the table. I think about my students here in New Haven, Connecticut, and what they would make of this conversation. I think it would not only feed them, but I think the message that they would take back is that they got a lot of work to do. They got to read. Knowledge is so vital. They have to engage with these disciplines seriously. And I appreciate the seriousness with which you engage with not only the knowledge of the disciplines that you're engaged in, but by providing an insight into your experience. I hope we can do this again soon. And I'm hoping to continue to build with each and every one of you. And please do stay in touch with each other and with us as we take this work forward and as you take this work forward. And our best wishes, I'm a faithful man, as I would say, prayers for the incredible work that you're doing. May it result in world changing, may it bring the kind of beloved and compassionate and just societies that we want to see. Thank you so much, everybody.